I think we have most of our people back, and if not, they can continue to trickle in as we begin the next session. This next session really speaks beyond this symposium. So certainly we've discussed a lot of topics, and I'm sure have started to really think of many of these ethical issues throughout the day. But really, as a goal of this symposium is also to talk about how ethics training and these type of concepts could be integrated into more of our training programs and education for clinicians, scientists, and students. So really, that's what our next session is all about. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Rosa Lynn Pinkus, who will discuss her experiences with bringing these types of ethics concepts to the classroom. Dr. Pinkus received her PhD from the State University of New York at Buffalo and currently holds faculty positions in both the School of Medicine and Department of Neurosurgery at the University of Pittsburgh. In addition, she is the Associate Director of the Center for Bioethics and Health Law and has directed the consortium ethics programs since its inception in 1990. Dr. Pinkus has extensive experience as an ethics consultant and has taught applied ethics for close to 30 years in the School of Medicine. She has also developed and teaches 2 required ethics courses for undergraduate and graduate bioengineering students at the Pitt Swanson School of Engineering at the University of Pittsburgh, in which I had the pleasure of being one of her students during my master's. In addition to these accomplishments, Dr. Pinkus has authored both an engineering ethics coursebook and a casebook for hospital personnel. Her research interests focus on studying how bioengineers and other healthcare professionals learn ethical reasoning using a case-based approach. And for these reasons, Dr. Pinkus is the perfect person to present to us about strategies for ethics education and curriculum development. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pinkus.
I'd like to thank Emma for inviting me, and also everyone else. This has just been a very rich opportunity for me to speak with people who have shared interests. Teaching bioengineering ethics is not a huge area that you can share stories and tactics and failures and successes. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We've had the whole day here. We've been talking about ethics and ethical issues. So I'd like a few of you to volunteer to tell me how you define ethics. Okay? This is the moment of, shifting gears, of actually doing a cognitive shift, of starting to think something we've been using all day, concept, but how do you define it? When I say ethics, what is it you think we've been doing all day? How would you define it?
Hi. Well, I think somebody earlier in the day in the audience, might have been you, actually said it very nicely by saying when you've got that discomfort, when there's a dissonance, that something just doesn't feel right, that's where I think ethics is in play. And there's saying right and wrong, and then there's really just feeling that gut feeling of there's not an easy answer here. It's when things come together, and it takes a little bit more sorting through a lot of alternatives versus a clear right and wrong choice. That's what I see as the important part of the discussion of ethics.
Okay, thank you. That's a really good way to start.
So I'll disagree, because I see ethics not as something that an individual decides, but something that society decides. I think there's plenty of history of changes in ideas that go along with the changing zeitgeist. And so I may be bickering over details, but my sense is ethical is not an individual decision, but a societal decision. Individuals certainly have an opinion within that, but the way it plays out legally, socially, ethically, I think is a group activity.
Okay. So we've got the individual awareness of an ethical situation, the gut feeling that something is wrong. On the table we have, it's more of a societal decision it encompasses law, it encompasses social values. We had another, yeah.
And I'm not entirely sure if ethics would have an absolute standard. I think to me it's all relative. It's more like what the majority of the population in society deems something is appropriate or not.
Okay, so here we have someone saying there's no absolute standard, no societal standard. It's the majority.
When I think of ethics, I think of codes of ethics, which I realize
Okay.
is a little variation on it. And so then I think of the ethical reasoning process as applying those rules from a code to a particular problem.
Okay, okay. Let's take just a couple more, and then we'll start.
Just combining a couple things that were already said, I would say normative standards of behavior.
Okay. Now, the reason I do this, and I do this when I start teaching medical students, the residents, my consortium is made up of mid-level healthcare professionals who work in hospitals and regions all over Western Pennsylvania, and they come for ethics training. So they're on-the-job frontline professionals. Like when I look out at you, you're all, I say ethics, and there's the cartoon balloon over your head, and everybody has a different definition. And if we're going to talk about professional ethics this next hour, ideas about teaching professional ethics, it's really good to start with an agreed-upon definition of the term so that we're all on the same page when we start talking about how you evaluate it and how you assess it and what cases are important. And if I've taught applied ethics for over 30 years, and you can pick up a textbook, 5 textbooks, 10, and everyone's going to have a little different variation on the theme of how you define it. So just for this next hour, I'd like to talk about ethics as being a critical reflection into the nature and grounds of morality. This includes a critical reflection on what one does and why one does it. We're just going to stand back and we're going to reflect on the professional actions and the reasons for acting. And that critical reflection can take on many different forms. I'll be talking about that when I do get to the prepared part of my talk here. The goal is to identify and resolve ethical dilemmas, to structure issues in a way that classifies them for frontline professionals. A person who works in professional ethics at a university level like I do, I'm not a moral marine, okay? I'm not going to teach anyone to be moral. I'm not a policeman. I'm not snooping around, trying to find out who's doing things that are wrong. I'm going to make them right. I guess you could consider me more of an academician, helping people through difficult terrain. You were saying this morning that you found yourself in an area and you didn't know how to navigate it. What a person who teaches professional ethics can do is help the professionals navigate that terrain. When I go to do ethics consults early on, and still, I mean, you talk to a physician who's called a consult, and you go through the facts and the concepts, and you lay out what alternatives there are. And then they expect an answer, and ethicists don't provide the answers. They ask the tough questions, and then they try to help sort out what options are available for within that gray area for resolution. So the other thing I come with this bias that you're all ethicists. Since age 6, you've been making moral decisions. You haven't gotten to where you are professionally without facing tough ethical choices and resolving them. What we can do today is stand back a little bit and see how you resolve them. And once you critically reflect on them, would you resolve them any differently the next time you did it? The other thing I'd like you to do, I'm not going to have you listed because I don't want to take too much time on this, but how did you learn to be an ethical person? What went into that? Yeah, I'd like a couple of, just raise your hand. What went into that? If you say you're not a formal ethicist, but you've made ethical decisions. Yeah. Oh, okay.
I think if we're doing any research, I know some people, a lot of people in here probably are already doing research, so the minute you sit down and look at an IRB form or a consent form or talk with a subject or try to consent someone, you're probably at that point dealing with an application of ethics.
Okay. Okay, and yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to add role models, I think, are a great way of learning ethics, and that could start as early as your parents or professors in college or colleagues where you work, and I think that gives sometimes a means of learning.
Okay. Religion certainly plays in. What else? Just a couple more. What are some of the, yeah? Empathy. Walking in someone else's shoes, being able to take the other perspective. Yeah. Yeah. The reason I do this is each of you come to your profession with already molded with a set of values and moral stances that are, hello. Shall we answer that? Yeah. Tell them that I can't talk now. So you come to this with your own unique way of making moral decisions, ethical decisions. But when you look at professional ethics, if we get into the world of bioengineering ethics, there are codes of ethics that have been written. That's one of the marks of a profession. There's a code of ethics. There's laws. There's FDA standards. There's guidelines. So you don't totally park your own values, your own moral views at the door. But what you have to do is learn the consensus of values within that profession and then begin to use them to sort out some of the issues. So let's go through more of a structured view here. We've already mentioned a lot of these things, that bioengineering is practiced in a broad societal context. So the values of the society reflect onto you and to your work in bioengineering. But that's not, and there's also shared conflicts that society has. I mean, we've talked, I think that the first talk this morning, just reflects about some of the values that are very broad in our society today. Some corruption, wrongdoing. It reflects on a very particular act that we heard about this morning. The societal values are also tacit. And they're not easily identified. But the dilemmas that they raise are for society. I mean, your people are in a fishbowl with your research. That I just randomly pulled Hastings Center reports off the shelf and looked at the covers. Here's biotechnology and monstrosity and cloning. There's this evil kind of menacing look to this, even though the little, I don't know, it's not a child in the middle, is definitely has a hopeful look, and the scientists have this authoritative look, but it's a menacing view. And then this is also the same type of clash of secular religious visions. These are all tied to bioengineering, and finally the end, the medical joint venturing money, the big ticket. Getting money from drug companies, getting money from other companies to do research. This is just an overview of societal values. But bioengineering also incorporates the tacit values that comes from the particular wisdom you gain when you're learning a profession. Ciceros Creed. Do you know about Ciceros Creed? Raise your hand if you do. Only one person. Okay. What is Cicero's Creed here? It directs the engine. It's one of the creeds. It's one of the directives that turns up in a lot of the engineering codes of ethics, and that's that the engineer shall hold the safety of the public above all else. But if you're an engineer, you tacitly know that you accept that success balances costs, risks, and set end schedules. So when you're doing the balancing of the risk, you're playing around with the safety factor so that you can meet a schedule and you can also balance the cost. And I don't know if you can read, just think, Wally, everything that makes this thing go was supplied by the lowest bidder. And I wrote a book about the main engines with 2 engineering colleagues and an organizational sociologist who was able to sort through the sociological organizational structure of NASA. The first chapter of our book was called Low Bid Ethics, because there's an equation there that tacitly involves ethical decision making. And we did come up with, I don't have it here, but we came up with an engineering ethics framework that talks about the engineer and the organization. You can't talk about an engineering issue if you don't also capture the organizational ethic. And that was a question that came up earlier. It's important in engineering. Engineering isn't done in isolation. Nothing's done in isolation, but especially the work of engineers. They're in teams, they have managers, there's usually a hierarchical structure above you, and so there has to be a way that you as the individual engineer can communicate your concerns with the organizational levels to make them heard. So what are some of the goals of teaching professional ethics? I look at it as a supplement to traditional bioengineering education. And the goal is to make all of those tacit values explicit. And by tacit, I mean unsaid values. Things like when you're reading a consent form, what's hidden in that consent form? Again, I go back to Carl Elliott's, the one slide that showed that there was this list of issues that would preclude people from entering the trial, and the fact that this young man hadn't did meet them and was let in, literally did not violate the at least the list, to say nothing of the process, but the list. So if you were going over that consent form, whoever put that list together had left some things out. I want to equate bioengineering students with the conceptual needs, the conceptual tools that you need, so that when you're in a situation, you can identify what that situation is. You can articulate it, and you can resolve dilemmas inherent in your day-to-day work. I do this by teaching different methods of moral reasoning. One size doesn't fit all. And I also use cases, lots of cases, to get people talking about the issues, to start them thinking about what they're doing. And when a paradigm case, the idea of a paradigm case where there's one positive case that you know is right, and then there's a case that's definitely wrong. So that you can compare and contrast and see where your case, where your issue is along the gray area, and see if you can draw a line and decide why you've drawn the line when you make a decision. We'll talk about that a bit more. But the overall goal is to provide you, wherever you are. I mean, if you're a third-year student, what are the issues you have as a third-year graduate student? How can you resolve those? If you're a faculty member under the gun to get tenure, what types of skills do you need to sort out the issues that you confront daily? One definition of ethics that we didn't talk about was just what you do when no one's watching. Most of the issues that you confront are going to be day-to-day issues where it's just you. I remember the first ethics consult I did in the intensive care unit. And this is something else for those of you who are wanting to start teaching ethics. Ethics is like, people don't want to hear ethics. There was a very difficult case in the intensive care unit, and the critical care physician called me. He said, but we're not going to call it an ethics consult. We're just going to say it's the non-clinical aspects of care, because if they hear ethics, they're just not going to want to cooperate. I mean, it's like, what did I do wrong? And here comes the other. So it was a young man who was quadriplegic. He had dove into a child-sized swimming pool. He had a very high lesion. He was quadriplegic and respirator dependent, so he couldn't talk. He could only mouth his words. He had a family who believed in, that they were evangelical Christians. They believed in miracles. They got permission to put holy water into his IV. They were looking to transfer him. A nurse felt that he understood what was going on, but nobody was giving him nobody was talking to him, and they felt he should be making decisions, and his family was making all the decisions. And they asked if I would just come in and talk with him. Now, I'd never seen anyone on a respirator before, let alone quadriplegic. And I just went up next to him and I introduced myself, and he looked and he mouthed some words. And I thought I could understand him. And then he just looked at me and just said, "I'm afraid." And I thought, "What did you say?" He said, "I'm afraid." He didn't say it. He just mouthed it with his words. And I said, "Did you just say you're afraid?" And he said, he couldn't move his eyes. And I just looked at him and I said, "I heard you say that you were afraid. I'll be back. We'll talk." And then I went and I read the chart. And then I got terrified. What is he afraid of? I mean, does he know that he's quadriplegic? Does he know that he's all the questions that, has anybody talked to him? Does he know that they want to discharge him? Does he know that he has the option to have his respirator withdrawn at this point if there's problems? Does he know what his options are? And I went and I talked to everyone on the team. I went to talk to the nurses, to the physicians. There was a team effort to find out who had talked to him. And the problem was that they had just stopped talking to him. They had just kind of read him off. And so my involvement just got him back in stage center as somebody who could be in the equation again. And I wasn't involved much more than that. I would come back to see him. He eventually decided that he wanted his care withdrawn. And there was this nurse who had been in close contact with him, stayed with him. I mean, the family agreed, and the nurse, and it was very, very respectful, and there was a hospice-like mentality in the whole critical care unit, and I just realized that these are ethical issues. These are issues that have deep meaning. I could have turned away, right? I mean, I couldn't have turned away, but theoretically, I could have turned away. And that was my introduction into ethical consultations in that hospital setting. We had a clinical conference about that afterwards, and I used Franz Kafka's story, The Metamorphosis, the short story. Does anybody remember that story? Yeah. What's it about? Oh, he is a bug.
It's horrendous, and I just got this feeling of doom over the whole thing, and then somebody comes through and gives them food. I mean, that's about all I remember. It's just that I guess the title to me meant be on the lookout for some change that was happening, and this turning into a creature that didn't seem human is what I remember.
Yeah. Anybody want to add to that? Yeah, there was. They ignored him. They just closed off the room, put food under the door. There was one member of the family that related to him. But he didn't wake up and say, oh my God, I'm a bug, what am I going to do? He said, I got to catch the 5 o'clock train to work. So even though he was drastically changed, his person gradually changed, his personhood, but not at that time. And that was how I talked with the critical care staff about this young man who had become quadriplegic and respirator dependent, and why they were avoiding him, and the importance of talking to him. So standing back, critically reflecting on what one does and why one does it is intrinsic in you resolving an ethical dilemma. And you recognize that you're in a full-blown dilemma when you get that feeling of, for me, it was terror in a sense of realizing what was going on and what the options would be, and that I couldn't turn back and didn't know what I should do or how I should do it. What about the law? What about professional codes? What about FDI guidelines? What about your own personal morality, religion, professional competence, professional judgment? All of these come to play in the examination, but what I do in teaching is try to instruct students in looking at a structured way of handling a situation. And usually it starts with some type of scenario. And I taught the undergraduate bioethics class in engineering last spring, and there were 41 undergraduates, and I told them, by the time you leave this class, I want you to, if you walk away with one thing, it's that I want you to remember what are the facts of a case, both known and unknown? Because in my experience as an ethics consultant, there were, I'd say 80% of the cases that I was involved in could be resolved at the fact level. They were framed as major ethical dilemmas, but when you got down to it and talked to people, they could be resolved. They took a different shape, and I'll give you a quick example. Again, early on, before we had palliative care in our hospital, the ethics consultation service was called for many issues of patients near the end of life. Now they're really taken care of by palliative care, and there's not the dilemmas that there were. And there was a critical care physician who said, we have a case of futility in our unit. There's a 93-year-old man who's in multi-system organ failure. There's no hope for his recovery. He's on a respirator, and it's time to withdraw. We go to his wife, who's 90 years old. She's very competent. She's with him. She's very caring. And we ask her for permission to withdraw the ventilator, and she refuses. This has been going on for over 2 weeks. The nursing staff is feeling guilty treating this man because they feel he's suffering. So we'd like to see if you can do anything about this, intervene. So I went and I introduced myself to her, which I always do, got to tell people who you are, why you're there. And I sat down and talked to her for about 20, 25 minutes and watched how carefully she, cared for him and made him comfortable. And during the course of that conversation, I learned that she'd already contacted the funeral home, that she knew he was going to die, and she understood quite fully what his prognosis was. So the next day when I came back, we were talking again, and I just asked her, I said, I see that you keep adjusting his mask and such. Do you think that respirator's helping him? And she said, no, I don't. Sometimes I think he seems uncomfortable on it. And I told her, the doctors feel the same way. She said, I know. They come to me every day and ask me for permission to turn it off. I would never tell a doctor what to do. So I asked her if there was someone she trusted who would tell the doctor. And she said, oh yeah, our family physician. And it changed the whole nature of the case. Just by talking, discussing, finding out the values of the surrogate decision maker. And again, that afternoon, the family physician came in, and there was a conference, and that was the importance of the facts of the case. And so that's, and then the concepts are another important thing. And you've already seen the follow-up to this. But concepts are these easy terms, such as risk and safety and quality of life. And I've put disabled in there because I think that's a term that also has many meanings for different people. But you think that these are terms that are easily understood, but they're not. And this may be something that, yeah.
Can I just ask for a clarification on the previous slide? An unknown fact was, you gave an example of an unknown fact, so you had to discover something that wasn't, you didn't have in hand?
Right. An unknown fact would be something that you say, I can't really resolve this because there are facts in this situation that are not known yet. Now, you may never find what those facts are, but you have to acknowledge that there are facts missing. And if you go into the more philosophical realm, you know, what is a fact and what is a value? I mean, but this is practical ethics, right? And please, anytime you want to interrupt me, please do. Okay. So this is how you can get into trouble when you don't clarify your concepts. And this is a quote. Does anyone know who Amy Mullins is?
She lost both of her legs. Actually, she was born without them. Yes, and so she modeled. She was in a couple of movies. She ran with them. She's been a really amazing disability advocate, or ability advocate, I should say. So,
she has the same medical disability that Oscar Pistorius, who, if any of you watched the Olympics, had. And Amy says there's an important difference, and we're talking about concepts again, what that concept of disability means. And there's an important difference and distinction between the objective medical fact of my being an amputee and the subjective societal opinion of whether or not I'm disabled. Truthfully, the only real consistent disability I've had to confront in the world is the world ever thinking that I could be described in those definitions. And she went on in another talk that she gave to give some definitions of disability that she had read in the 1980 thesaurus. Disability, disabled, crippled, helpless, useless, wrecked, stalled, mangled, lame, wounded, mutilated, run down, weakened, hurt, useless, weak. And the antonym is healthy, strong, capable. She said when she first read it, she thought it was laughable, and then the assault of the words hit her. And she thought, well, this is my old 1980 thesaurus. She got online, looked at the thesaurus from 2009. Disabled, blind, deaf, mute, lame, paralyzed, quadriplegic, immobile, sick, unhealthy. Antonyms: whole, wholesome. The concepts that we use and the meanings that those concepts have. I think that that term, for those of you who are in rehabilitation, I think that term is changing. I think the meaning, it's very interesting to me to see how we can give different meaning to concepts. If you go through looking at the facts of a case and the concepts of a case, and you haven't been able to resolve what the issue is, then you can invoke professional guidelines. You can then go to principles, theoretical perspectives to help you see the big picture of possibly where you're going. Case-based analysis for frontline professionals is really a good way to begin understanding what the options are for resolution. Hopefully when we're talking, some of what I'm saying may be bringing to mind cases or issues or concepts that you encountered, that you start making comparisons with your own professional background. And then you need to consider alternative resolutions and select one resolution that, it sounds lofty, but this is ethics, that upholds the moral community and be able to justify it. So here you are. I mean, facts, identify them, known, unknown. Concepts, identify them, known, unknown. And this is with whoever is involved in the situation. It's not you sitting in a room alone doing this analysis. And then looking for guidelines, principles, theories, whatever that you can to help you get some alternatives to understand the situation. Select one. Again, practical ethics. You don't have the leisure to just not act. So there is time involved, and you do have to make decisions. And if you just stand back and critically reflect, that's an ethical act. And that can help you sort out and justify your resolution. Just taking time to do that. Okay, balancing case studies, theories, and principles. There is a consensus, and there has been a consensus for a long time in bioethics, that case studies, and I'm paraphrasing Art Kaplan here, are the glue that holds the field of professional ethics together. They can be thin and stylized. A lot of the philosophical cases early on were just written to make a point. A football player gets injured in the game, comes into the emergency room with a broken leg, complains of pain, and the emergency room physician gives him 2 aspirins. And he says, "Doc, I need more than this." And the doctor says, "Oh, no, you don't. You're a big guy. What's at odds here?" There's the patient saying, "I need help," and there's the physician saying, no, I know better than you do what you need. That's a case from the early bioethics books. I don't even know if it's still being used. But you can get stylized cases so that you know exactly what you're supposed to be learning from the case. Or John Aris has a paper that says, no, you should use thick, messy cases. Cases that challenge students to identify the morally relevant facts and concepts and issues. So I don't have a case here in front of me, but if we had taken the article that Carl posted and just went through that and said, what are the facts here? Are there any unknown facts? What are the concepts? What are the ethical issues? Begin to parse it out in a way that makes it more understandable, because the emotional impact of that leaves you feeling barraged with so much that had happened. When I talk about case-based reasoning, there actually is a method of case-based reasoning called casuistry. Anyone familiar with that term?
Well, it suggests that there's a case-based reasoning, and that as you change the particulars of the case, there may be a different conclusion drawn, if you will. I don't know if I've even got the right definition, but. Well.
If memory serves me, going back many, many years to my liberal arts education, it refers to the Middle Ages and I think it was connected in some cases with the Jesuits, who could basically reason themselves out of any situation. So it was a derogatory term, though in contradistinction to those who believed in more of an absolute morality. Casuistry was the ability to apply reasoning and sort of more of a relativistic world.
That's exactly right, and that it had lost favor to the analytic philosophical method until the 1980s, when Al Johnson and Stephen Toulmin resurrected it as a reputable method of ethical reasoning. The problem with casuistry is it's and all of the methods, all of the principles, and all of the theories, all of them have shortcomings. So if you're going to take a method, if you're going to use utilitarianism as a method, you're always going to harm the individual person. If you're going to use rights of persons, you're never going to do social justice. If you're going to use casuistry, you're never going to get outside your community of values. It's insular in many ways. I've got a lot of cases that I could use to illustrate that, but I'm not going to do that right now. I start every class with small group case discussion. And students move their chairs, they decide who they want to talk to, they discuss a case. It gets them active in their learning. The case is posted beforehand, and there's always questions posed to structure the discussion. I walk around, my TA walks around, we listen in, we comment. When students are engaged in critically listening to the views of their peers, effective learning can be achieved. You can learn so much from hearing what your peers say about a given issue, and then have it brought back to the class, structured, and then tied to what the theme of the class is that day, tied to informed consent. There's a researcher who, Emma, actually worked in his lab when she was in Pittsburgh, and he does motion research with the knee. And he gives, and when he's working on experiments, there's some radiation that the patients are exposed to. And I asked him if he would talk in my class. And I went over, I went to the lab, I saw what he did. We had a great, I really learned a lot about it. And he came, I said, well, why don't you give the students your informed consent form and let them take a look at it and critique it. And then you come, we'll talk about informed consent, and then you come and talk about your research, which is what he did. So before he came, they had his consent form, and they read it, and they looked at it, and they critiqued it. And then he came. So that was the more structured part of it. Instead of just talking about what informed consent is, I bring in a form that is directly related to bioengineering. If I'm teaching bioengineers, I don't want to teach them something that's going on in in another field of engineering. I use bioengineering examples so that it isn't ethics is over here and bioengineering is over here. It's intertwined. I mean, and the more you start thinking about how the issues arise, and the more you start thinking about the facts and the concepts and the alternatives, you'll begin to see issues in the work that you're doing that maybe you didn't see before. It's very important in teaching ethics to create an environment where students feel free to comment and argue. Intrinsically, there's a respect for persons in the classes that I teach, because intrinsically I respect persons. I mean, I don't think you can fudge it. I don't think you can start an ethics class and say, we're going to make this. You know, there's some things that I think as a teacher you have to just convey in your classroom. And in an ethics class, you really have to give it over to the students, whoever they are, whether they're first, second, third year medical students, bioengineering students, mid-level professionals. They're the ones who have the expertise, the domain expertise. All I can do is teach the structured way of viewing it. I always tell the students, the frameworks don't do the work you do. You're the moral Marines. And not the moral Marines, you're the moral agent. Okay, it's late in the day. Okay, so also I want to get students out of the classroom. And I have served on ethics committees in the UPMC system, and both the Children's Ethics Committee and the Adult Presby Ethics Committee welcome observers. They have to get permission to go, they have to sign up, they have to understand confidentiality, and then they have to write a report about what the activity was. And this is one of the most successful activities in the class. Students come away thinking, this is really important. These were, people talking about policy, talking about organ donation and what to do with online donation, and just issues that come up. And so they get out of the classroom and also see ethics, I call it ethics in action, and go to grand rounds. So, and what do I include in the summary? Okay, you probably know by now what I'm going to ask them to include in the summary. A description of the ethical dilemma presented, how were they resolved, what were the facts, what were the concepts, what were the questions, could they identify any moral reasoning that the people at the committee meeting or in the lecture used? And they'd say, well, you know, they were talking about, it seemed to me like they were talking about rights of persons, but, you know, nobody said it. And that's the truth. I mean, nobody really uses the labels. They just do the work. So seeing ethics in action can help students appreciate that professionals take ethics seriously. This is another case that I use. And anybody know about the Synograft case? Bioengineering at Pitt started as a certificate program in the cardiac area. So a lot of the students have that cardiac specialization. Synograft was a published article. It reported the early failure of the tissue-engineered porcine heart valve in pediatric patients. There were 4 patients implanted with the valve over a year's period. 3 of them died, one at 6 weeks, one at 1 year, one at 7 days. And then there was one that had the valve still implanted, and there was a dilemma as to what to do about that one infant. These were physicians reporting mistakes. It's a paper that not only instructs about what went wrong with the heart valve. It wasn't totally cellularized. I mean, they did the research after to find out why the valve failed. Talking about translational research, this again, it teaches you something about a field of engineering. It shows you that these researchers had the courage to publish their results, to warn others not to use this valve, and again, it is a way to just rehearse the methods that I'm teaching in class. Another one is a Telextronics pacemaker that had a new J lead. It was, the information for this case was given to me by a colleague from the FDA who was the officer in the department where this case occurred. And actually, it was a new lead designed for the surgeons to have an easier implant. And so that was what the J was about. And there was a sheath over the wire. And the lead was to be placed into the heart. And the testing for this lead was 3,000 cycles of testing. And that was those were the requirements. A stack of papers, I'm about 2 feet high. It was eventually recalled after being implanted in 40,000 patients. Students who have, I have the students sort through the primary source materials and create a very sophisticated staged case over these materials. The perspective of a bioengineer who was on the case. They made this all up, but they used the facts of the FDA case, the manager and the FDA. And the student is faced with having to sign off on this. It satisfied everything, and he questions the 3,000 cycles. Any of you question the 3,000 cycles? That was the FDA requirements for testing. If you don't have the background in cardiophysiology, which is something I realize in teaching bioengineering students, they're very specialized areas. So when I teach this, we do a primer in cardiophysiology. But somebody do the math. How many times does your heart beat in a minute? So what's the lifetime of a pacemaker supposed to be? How many years? 7, 10. So that lead was like if you're bored and you're taking a paper clip and bending it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Actually, the sheath didn't protect the wire, and it fractured, and the wire came out. So students have to make a decision. Their manager says, don't, we're going ahead with this, and the student has to decide what to do, and then they make the decision, and then 2 weeks later, I show a video from Telectronics talking about the recall and have somebody come in talk about the mechanical failure and such. Yeah, I know that. So when we do the capstone study is having students write their own paper based on their own research. And it's important in understanding their own knowledge domain. And this is a rubric that was defined under an NIH grant that I did with several colleagues. And it defines what a good bioengineering ethics analysis is. We took the last one, uses a method of moral reasoning correctly, and objectified it. Did a study over a period of time. And what we found was students who had a deep understanding of their research scored higher on their case study. When we broke that down, and if anybody wants the rubric, we could say that if you have a deep knowledge of your professional domain and create a case study and analyze it, you more easily understand how to apply the methods of moral reasoning. Okay, and here we broke it down within the research group, and we could find that there was a novice research group, and compared that with, it really didn't differ from the group who wrote a paper that wasn't based on their area of expertise at all. They were non-experts. The reasoning is that if you're really excited about in an ethics course and you want to write a paper on genetics of food modification, but you're in rehab ethics, you've got to research that whole topic of food modification to get all the facts and the concepts and the issues. And then you have to apply methods of moral reasoning to that. So if you start from an area that you know, hopefully you already have some tacit understanding of the field, and it's much easier then to apply those methods. Now again, that's what I'm trying to teach in the class, methods of moral reasoning. And this is our last slide. So I don't know which comes first, technical or ethical knowledge. And this isn't a question that has been resolved successfully for centuries. So maybe our panel, who is coming up next, will shed some light on this question and also on some of their experiences in teaching professional ethics. And we're going to just move right into the panel, and then I'll take questions as well.
We can say a quick thank you, though, for the experience you shared with us.
And I have a thank you, too, to my colleagues at University of Pittsburgh.